They mocked Terran youth, then Warrior called him brother. The pipe was leaking for the third time that week. Not badly, just a slow drip that collected in a shallow puddle on the floor of the lower maintenance corridor, reflecting the amber-strip lights in a way that looked almost peaceful. Ryo crouched beside it with a wrench in one hand and a diagnostic tool in the other, and he fixed it the same way he had fixed it the 2 times before. Quietly, without telling anyone, because nobody had asked him to. That was fine, he was used to that. The GSV Resolute was a long ship, wide corridors on the upper decks, narrow and dim on the lower ones, always filled with the low hum of the engine core running somewhere deep beneath the floor. It carried 42 cadets in the Joint Species Training Program. 41 of them were Varath. Ryo was the other one. The Varath were tall, 7 feet on the short end, gray-scaled, built like the word war had been turned into a body. They had clan names that went back 9 generations and battle records that started before some of their cadets could walk. They did not speak loudly in the corridors. They did not need to. The weight of what they were did the talking for them. Ryo had no clan name. He had no battle record. He had scored higher than any living being on record in adaptive problem-solving and stress response testing, but nobody on this ship had asked to see those scores. He had been assigned the bunk closest to the engine exhaust vent, which vibrated at night. He had been given the maintenance rotation that no one else wanted. At meals, he sat at the end of the bench and the space around him stayed empty a few inches longer than it should have. None of it was cruel. That was almost the strange part. The Varath had a code, open cruelty was beneath them. What they offered instead was the particular silence of people who had already decided you were not worth the energy of a full thought. Ryo had grown up poor in a coastal storm city on Earth. He knew the difference between an enemy and someone who simply did not see you. The second one was lonelier. He finished the pipe repair, dried the floor with a rag from his kit, and logged the fix in the ship's maintenance system under his cadet number. No name, just the number. On his way back through the corridor, he passed 2 Varath cadets heading to the upper deck. They were mid-conversation, something about a sparring score, and they moved around him the way water moves around a small rock, not aggressively, just automatically, as though he were a feature of the hallway rather than a person in it. Ryo kept walking. The simulation bay was used 3 times a week. It smelled like hot metal and fake atmosphere, and the floor was made of pressure plates that could simulate collapse, tilt, or resistance depending on what the exercise required. Today it was a timed search and secure. Find the signal beacon inside a collapsing structure, retrieve it, get out before the environment failed. Simple in concept. Brutal in execution, especially if your legs were shorter than everyone else's by about 2 feet. Ryo finished last, not close last, actually last by 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Anu did not say anything directly to him. Anu was the kind of person who did not need to say things directly. He had a way of letting silence do the work. A glance held 1 second too long, a slight turn of the head that said everything without committing to it. He was about Ryo's age in equivalent years, sharp-boned and fast, and he had finished the simulation first. He stood near the exit with his arms crossed, and his eyes doing the quiet thing they did, and Ryo walked past him without looking up. The debrief was held in the same room with the lights brought up full. The training officer ran through performance scores. Ryo sat in the back row and waited. Then he raised his hand. The training officer paused. Ryo said calmly that the support grid in the simulation had a secondary fault. He had seen it in the data, a cascading failure in the lower east junction that the primary structure had been masking. In a real scenario, everyone who completed the mission successfully would have been inside the building when it came down, approximately 40 minutes after extraction. The room was quiet. Nobody said well done. The debrief moved on to the next item on the list. Ryo lowered his hand and sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the table. At the back of the room, partly in shadow, Drax stood with a datapad held loosely in one hand. He was the Varath trainer, the kind of quiet that came from having seen enough that nothing surprised him anymore. He had not moved during the debrief. He had not reacted when Ryo spoke. His face gave nothing away. But his stylus moved. Slowly, deliberately, he wrote something on the datapad. He did not look up from it as the cadets filed out. He did not look toward Ryo specifically. He just wrote, and the scratch of the stylus against the screen was the only sound he made. And when the room was empty, he stood there alone for a moment longer before he, too, walked out. Ryo went back to his bunk. The exhaust vent vibrated. Outside the small porthole above his bed, the stars did not move, because stars that far away never seemed to, even when the ship was cutting through space at full drift speed. He lay on his back and looked at them and thought about the fault line in the simulation, and about the way the room had gone quiet, and about how quiet and invisible were two very different things. He was not sure yet which one he was. He closed his eyes. The vent kept vibrating. He had fixed everything on this ship that needed fixing. He would fix it again tomorrow if it broke again. That was what he did. The obstacle course ran along the outer training ring of the Resolute, where the walls were thick reinforced plate and the floor was built to take punishment. It was divided into 5 zones. The first was a compression tunnel that increased gravity pressure by 3 times standard as you moved through it. The second was a burst sprint corridor with resistance walls that pushed back against forward motion. The third was a thermal chamber, sealed, orange-lit, hot enough that the air itself felt heavy. The fourth was a vertical climb through a moving frame. The fifth was a flat sprint to the finish marker. It was designed for Vareth bodies. Everyone knew that. Nobody said it out loud because it did not need to be said. Cadets ran it one at a time, while the others watched from the side corridor through a reinforced observation strip. Ryo stood near the back of the group and watched each Vareth move through the course with the efficiency of people built for exactly this. Long-limbed, powerful, the gravity zones barely slowing them. The thermal chamber crossed in long, fast strides, steam rising from their gray scales as they came through the exit. 2 cadets tapped out in the thermal chamber. Not because they were weak. The temperature inside was genuinely extreme, and the safety threshold existed for a reason. They hit it, triggered the exit protocol, and walked out with their heads up because there was no shame in it. The course was hard, even for them. Then it was Ryo's turn. He moved through the compression tunnel slowly. There was no other way to move through it at his size. The gravity increase hit differently on a smaller frame, pressing down on his spine and shoulders in a way that made each step feel like carrying a second person. He moved through it anyway, one step at a time, his breathing controlled and deliberate. The burst sprint corridor was almost funny, he thought. The resistance walls were calibrated for something with more mass behind it. Against him, they just pressed. He leaned into them and pushed and moved forward by degrees, which was slower than the Vareth but technically still forward motion. Then he entered the thermal chamber. The heat was immediate, not like standing near a fire, like stepping into something that had a weight of its own. The chamber was about 30 meters long, and the temperature was constant from entry to exit, orange-tinted emergency lighting making it feel hotter than it already was. Ryo had been in something like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. He dropped into the breathing pattern his mother had taught him when he was 8 years old, during the first big coastal storm that hit their city while they were still in the outer shelter zones. Slow inhale. Controlled exhale. Keep the chest steady. Regulate from the diaphragm, not the throat. Move like you have somewhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. He walked through the thermal chamber. Not fast, not graceful. He was sweating through his uniform inside of 10 seconds, and his face had gone the color of something left too long in the sun. But he was walking. And his breathing stayed even, and each step landed where he put it. From the observation corridor, Sira watched without expression. She was the human senior liaison officer aboard the Resolute mid-40s, with the kind of face that had learned to keep its opinions behind a neutral surface. She had read Ryo's file 3 times before the program started. She had been watching since the first day. She did not smile exactly, but the line of her jaw softened by a degree. Anu watched from the corridor with the other cadets. His arms were folded. His expression was doing its usual careful work of showing nothing. But his eyes tracked Ryo through the observation strip without moving, following each slow step through the chamber, and the thing on his face that was not quite an expression stayed there longer than usual. Ryo came out the exit end of the thermal chamber. He stood in the exit corridor and breathed, just breathed, for about 15 seconds, hands on his knees. Then he straightened up and walked to the vertical climb. He finished the course last, slower than last place by almost 7 minutes. He sat down on the floor when he crossed the finish marker because his legs had made the decision before he had. Nobody walked over. He did not expect anyone to. That night he could not make himself sleep. Not because of the vent was the same as always. Something else. A frequency. He had noticed it 3 days ago in the lower maintenance corridor, a vibration in the secondary coolant pipe that sat just slightly off from where it should be. Not enough for the ship's automated system to flag, just enough to bother him. He got up, took his cracked hand scanner, and went back to the corridor. He spent 2 hours pulling historical maintenance logs and running them against the current sensor data, crouched on the floor with the scanner propped against the wall and the amber light making everything look like old photographs. What he found was not alarming yet. It would become alarming in about 3 weeks if nobody addressed it. A slow stress fracture developing in the pipe mounting, the vibration pattern a symptom rather than the cause. He documented everything he found, wrote a clear maintenance report with the exact location, the probable cause, and a suggested fix, and sent it to the ship's engineering queue. Then he went back to bed. In his quarters, Drac was awake. He was often awake at this hour. The notification appeared on his datapad, a maintenance report filed from cadet number 7741, flagging a secondary coolant fault in corridor 4 lower. He read it, then he set the datapad down. Then he picked it up and read it again. Outside the porthole of the observation corridor, space moved the way it always did, which was to say it did not move at all, and everything was still, and the stars kept their positions like they had made a promise about it. Drac sat with the datapad in his hand and did not sleep, and the ship hummed beneath him, and the coolant pipe in corridor 4 lower vibrated very slightly at a frequency that one cadet, out of 42, had decided was worth losing sleep over. The moon had no name in the Galactic Sovereignty Registry, just a catalog number and a note that said atmosphere degrading type 4. The sky above it was the color of old pewter, and the ground was pale rock fractured into uneven shelves, with shallow ravines cutting between them like cracks in dried clay. The research team had been down there for 6 days running seismic data. On the 7th day, their atmospheric shelter had partially failed, and they had stopped responding to standard channels. The Resolute redirected. The away team was assembled in the lower shuttle bay within the hour. Drac picked the team himself. Anu, 3 Vareth soldiers, Brev, Soot, and Heron, and at the last moment as the boarding ramp was closing, Sira appeared at the bay entrance and said Ryo was going. She said it in the quiet, specific way she had of stating things that were not arguments and were not requests either. Drac looked at her. Then he looked at Ryo, who was standing slightly behind her with his kit bag already on his back. Drac nodded once and turned back toward the shuttle. They landed on a flat shelf of rock about 2 kilometers from the last registered position of the research team. The shuttle engines cut and the ramp opened, and the atmosphere came in thin and sharp and smelling of sulfur compounds and something else underneath, something mineral and cold. Everyone put their breather filters in. The sky pressed down in that gray pewter way. The rock made no sound. Then the comms went ecstatic. It happened fast. One moment Drac had a clean channel to the Resolute. The next there was nothing but white noise and the distant pop of atmospheric interference. He tried the short-range team channel. That one held, barely. Long range was gone. Move to the research team's last coordinates, Drax said, quickly. They moved. Anu set the pace, long Vareth strides across the rock, efficient and fast. Ryo kept up at the back of the group with shorter strides and more of them, his cracked hand scanner already out, running topographic data against the moon's geological survey maps. The survey maps were 4 years old. He was cross-referencing them against the seismic readings the research team had been collecting. There were numbers in those readings that he kept coming back to. They reached the registered coordinates and found nothing. The shelter had been moved. There were scuff marks in the pale rock dust and 2 equipment anchors left behind, pulled up in a hurry, and a directional marker scratched into a flat stone pointing northeast. The research team had relocated. Northeast route, Anu said, already reading the terrain. There was a direct path across 2 connected shelves of rock, down a short drop to a lower level and northeast from there. Faster, cleaner. He began moving. Ryo looked at his scanner. Then he looked at the route. Then he looked at the seismic data again. "I would not go that way," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not carry any particular urgency. He said it the way he might mention that a pipe was vibrating at the wrong frequency, flatly, because it was true, not because he expected anyone to respond to it. Anu paused. He turned his head partly, not quite looking back. "Why?" "There is a subsurface pressure collapse zone running under that shelf. The survey data is old, but the research team's seismic readings have been tracking a stress fracture moving east for the last 3 days. That direct route crosses over it." Ryo held up the scanner. "There is a longer path around the eastern ridge. Adds about 20 minutes. Anu looked at the direct route. The rock looked solid. It looked like every other piece of rock on this moon. He looked at it for 2 seconds and then he kept walking. Ryo stopped. He did not follow. He watched Anu move onto the shelf with Brev beside him, and he noted the way the rock under their feet had a very slight hollow resonance that the other sections did not, and he thought about the sound that particular kind of rock made back home before it gave way, and he was still thinking about it when the shelf gave way under Anu. It was not a full collapse. The surface cracked and tilted, and the section Anu was standing on dropped half a meter in less than a second, one edge crumbling fast into the ravine below. Anu went sideways, scrambled, caught the higher edge with both hands, and the rock under his hands began breaking too. Ryo was already moving. He grabbed Anu's collar with both hands, not elegant, not the right grip, just the first grip available, and planted his feet wide on the solid rock behind the break line, dropping his weight down and back in the way that coastline people learn to brace against things pulling at them. His boots scraped. His arms burned. His whole body was shaking with the load, and he did not let go. Brev and Heron reached them in seconds and pulled Anu up properly from the other side. The whole thing was over in less than half a minute. Anu stood on solid ground. He was breathing hard. He looked at the ravine below the break, at the long drop, and then he looked at the middle distance and said nothing. On the shuttle back, the team was quiet. The engines were loud. Near the end of the flight, Drax, sitting across from Ryo, spoke without preamble. "You knew before we stepped on it." Ryo looked out the small porthole. The pewter sky of the moon was already far behind them, just a gray shape against the dark. "I grew up near fault lines," he said. Drax did not answer. He sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the opposite wall and did not look away from Ryo for the remainder of the flight, not watching him the way you watch a curiosity. Watching him the way you watch something you have been trying to name for a long time and have only just found the word for. There was a corridor on the lower level of the Resolute that most crew passed through only when they had to. It ran along the ship's inner hull, and one wall was fitted with a long strip of reinforced observation, windows, thick glass with a faint green tint, looking out into open space. During the ship's day cycle, it was used as a shortcut. During the night cycle, it was used by almost no one. The light here came from a single amber strip along the floor and from the stars outside. which were many and cold and perfectly still. Ryo found the corridor by accident on his third night aboard and had been returning to it ever since. There was something about the particular quality of silence there, not the silence of a room where sound had stopped, but the older silence of space itself, pressing gently against the glass. He was standing at the window when Drac came in. Neither of them said anything about it, about the fact that they were both there, both awake, both apparently unable to do the thing that sleep required. Drac moved to the window and stood a few feet away and looked out. For a while that was all. Then Drac said, "Do you know the word?" Ryo said he did not. Drac was quiet for a moment, the way he was always quiet, not searching for words but deciding which ones to use. It means the weight a person carries without complaint, not suffering, not endurance for its own sake, something more specific. He paused. A being who has been made by difficulty, who did not break under it, who does not speak of it. He looked at the stars. In our culture, Vethkai cannot be performed. If you perform it, it is not the real thing. It can only be seen in a person, by someone who knows what they are looking at. Ryo said nothing. "I saw it in you on the first day," Drac said. "The water recycler in Corridor 4, the maintenance report at 2 in the morning, the simulation debrief." He did not say the thermal chamber or the moon, but they were in the air between them. "I have been a trainer for 11 years. I have seen cadets try very hard to appear to have Vethkai. You are not trying to appear to have anything." Ryo looked out the window. Below them, below in the way that space had a below if you chose one, a scatter of distant light moved very slightly as the ship drifted on its heading. "I was just fixing a pipe," he said. "Yes," Drac said, "that is exactly it." They stood in silence for a while. Then Ryo started talking about Earth, not the version in the Galactic Sovereignty records, which was all percentages and atmospheric recovery timelines and near-extinction event classifications. The actual version. The city he grew up in, on the western coast, where the storms came in off the water every season, and the buildings had been rebuilt so many times that the walls were layered. Old construction inside new construction inside patches from 3 generations back. Each layer a different color if you cut into the stone. His mother knew which layer was which, and what year each one had gone up, and what had knocked the previous one down. He talked about the way the ground sounded different before it moved. He talked about the smell of the air before a storm that was going to be bad. He talked about learning, young, that the world was not a safe place, and that this was simply a fact, not a tragedy, and that you built your house and you fixed your pipes and you learned to read the rock and you kept going because what else were you going to do? Drac listened without interrupting. When Ryo stopped talking, Drac was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The Varath word for Earth in old dialect does not translate to third planet. It translates to the one that refuses." Ryo looked at him. "We have records of Earth going back 400 years, Drac said. Before first contact, we were observing. There was a period several of your centuries when the data suggested the planet would not recover. Climate, resource collapse, internal conflict on a scale our analysts classified as terminal." He paused. "They were wrong. Our analysts had never encountered a species that would look at terminal and decide it was a suggestion." Ryo said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "We thought about quitting, probably." "Probably," Drac agreed, "but you did not." The stars outside had not moved. They never moved at this speed from this distance. The parallax was too small to see with the naked eye. Ryo looked at them and thought about the layers in his mother's walls, each one a different color, each one evidence of something that had fallen and been replaced. In the mess hall the next day, something different happened. Anu sat down across from Ryo without asking. He did not apologize. He did not explain himself. He began eating and then, after a pause that lasted almost 2 full minutes, he pushed a second food tray across the table. He said that in Varath tradition, when a warrior steps into a role that belonged to another warrior, even informally, even without ceremony, the first thing owed is a meal. He said it flatly, looking at the table. It was not exactly what had happened between them. They both knew that. Neither of them said so. Ryo looked at the tray. He pulled it toward him. They ate in silence for most of the meal. Near the end, Anu asked, without looking up, how humans knew where fault lines were. Ryo explained pressure data, rock density, the way hollow ground had a different resonance when struck. He demonstrated by knocking his knuckles on the table, then the metal bench support, illustrating the difference in sound. Anu listened with his eyes on his food. He did not respond. But his ears, the flat, scaled auditory plates along the sides of his head, angled forward slightly. Just slightly. The Vareth equivalent of leaning in. Ryo noticed. He said nothing about it. Outside the mess hall windows, the stars continued their long, patient vigil, and the Resolute moved through them, and the layers kept adding up. The Korathi vessel Clarity of Motion had been running in formation with the Resolute for 11 days when its reactor went wrong. It did not announce itself dramatically. There was no explosion, no alarm that the Resolute's crew heard first. There was a quiet signal on the joint channel, a Korathi emergency code, flat and procedural, the way Korathi communicated everything. And then Admiral Vane's voice, precise and unhurried, explaining that his ship had a tertiary venting failure in the lower reactor housing and that evacuation was underway. The Korathi were a small species, narrow-framed, pale-skinned, with large dark eyes adapted for the dim interior environments they preferred. Their ships were built to their scale, tight corridors, low ceilings, systems designed for hands smaller than human standard. Their reactor housing in the lower decks was a maze of conduit channels running between thermal regulators, each channel barely wide enough for a Korathi engineer to move through at a crouch. The tertiary venting system ran through those channels. Its manual override was located deep inside, at a junction point that required someone physically present to operate. Without the override, the automated suppression would fail in approximately 40 minutes. The evacuation window, the point past which the affected crew section could not safely exit, was 30 minutes from now. Admiral Vane stated this on the joint channel. Then he said, "It is an acceptable loss scenario. Evacuation will proceed for the accessible sections. The crew in the affected section will not reach the exit in time. We acknowledge this." He said it with the flat logic of a species that had never found a reason to do otherwise. Not cruelty, just the mathematics of survival, stated plainly. In the Resolute's coordination bay, Ryo was already at a terminal. He had pulled the Korathi vessel schematics from the joint database and was reading the reactor housing layout. He went through it once fast and then once slow, and the second time through he stopped at the conduit channel map and looked at it for a long time. He knew this system. Not this exact version. The Korathi build ran tighter and the material was different. But the underlying design, the way the tertiary vent looped back through the secondary thermal channel before reaching the override junction, the placement logic. He had seen it before, or close enough to before that it counted, on a black market freighter docked at a labor port on Earth's southern coast when he was 16. He had spent 3 weeks repairing a knockoff version of this same reactor, housing configuration, to earn the last portion of his academy application fees. He had learned that system from the inside out, because there had been no one else available who was small enough to fit in the channels and willing to learn fast enough. He told Drac. He said it quietly, standing beside the terminal, pointing at the channel map on the screen. He said he could navigate the Korathi conduit system, reach the override junction, and complete the fix if someone could read him the Korathi coordinate system in real time, because his Korathi spatial notation was not strong enough to do it from memory under pressure. He said he needed to go now because the 30-minute window was already losing minutes. Drac looked at the screen. He looked at the channel dimensions. He looked at Ryo. He did not argue. He did not ask if Ryo was certain. He had been watching Ryo long enough to know the difference between someone who said they could do something and someone who knew they could. He put his hand on Ryo's shoulder, flat palm, steady pressure, the Varath gesture that had no direct translation but meant something like, "I see you standing here, and I am standing here with you," reserved, in their culture, for warriors of equal standing. He said, "Then go, I will be your voice." The transfer to the clarity of motion took 4 minutes by emergency connector bridge. A Korathi crew member met Ryo at the reactor-level access point, said nothing, handed him a small toolkit calibrated to Korathi fittings, and stepped back. The access panel was low. Ryo had to crouch to get through it. Inside, the heat was immediate and structural, the kind that lived in the walls rather than in the air. The conduit channels were barely wide enough for his shoulders. He moved on hands and knees. Drax's voice came through the earpiece, steady, reading coordinates from the schematic in a flat cadence that gave Ryo exactly what he needed and nothing extra. Left at the secondary thermal junction. Straight through the regulator coupling. The override is at the third branch point after the pressure valve. The toolkit Korathi fittings were non-standard. Of course they were. The main adjustment wrench was the wrong size for the override housing. He could see that within the first 10 seconds of reaching it. He took 2 components from his own kit, the ones he carried out of habit because they had been useful before, and improvised a fitting extension that would give him enough torque on the Korathi bolt pattern if he held it at the right angle. His hands were shaking slightly, not fear, temperature. He steadied them against the housing wall and worked. Drax counted down the time remaining without being asked. Not pressure information. The difference mattered. Ryo completed the override. The venting system engaged with a sound like a long exhale from something enormous, and the pressure reading on the small indicator panel beside the junction dropped from red to amber to green in the space of about 15 seconds. He put the tools back in the kit out of habit, and then he moved back through the channels and out the access panel and stood upright on the deck of the Korathi reactor level, and his legs informed him that they were finished making decisions for the moment, and he sat down on the floor instead. 40 seconds remained on the evacuation window. He knew because Drax had kept counting. Admiral Vane was there. He had come down himself, which was not the kind of thing Korathi admirals typically did, and he stood in front of Ryo with his hands at his sides and looked down at him. The long look of someone computing something that was taking longer than usual to compute. The radiation burns on Ryo's forearms were already visible, the skin red and tight from the conduit wall contact. "You are very small," Admiral Vane said, "to carry such a large thing." Ryo was still breathing hard. He looked up at the Korathi admiral and said, "Yeah, people keep saying that." Vane looked at him for another moment. Then he looked at the access panel. Then he looked back at Ryo with the expression of a person whose mathematics had just returned an answer they had not expected. He said nothing else. He did not need to. From the connector bridge behind them, Drax arrived at a pace that was not quite running, but was as close as a Varath trainer's dignity would permit. He took one look at the burns on Ryo's arms and said nothing, because there was nothing to say about it that the moment had not already said better. The medical bay on the Resolute was white and smelled of antiseptic and the faint chemical sharpness of regenerative gel. The beds were built for Varath patients, which meant Ryo's feet did not reach the end of his, and the monitoring cuff on his arm was several sizes too large and had to be taped in place. The burns on his forearms were not dangerous. The medic had said this clearly twice, in the way medical staff say things clearly to patients who they expect might not believe them. First degree with minor second-degree patches. Manageable. 2 days of monitoring, gel application, no heavy use of the hands. Ryo spent those 2 days mostly looking at the ceiling. Drax came the first evening. He came through the door, moved the chair from the wall to beside the bed, and sat down. He did not bring anything. He did not open with a question or an observation or any of the things people usually opened with when visiting someone in a medical bay. He sat, and the silence was comfortable in the specific way that silences are comfortable when the person creating them has decided the silence is a gift rather than an absence. He stayed for an hour. He said at the end only, "The pipe in corridor 4 lower has been repaired, properly this time." Then he left. Ryo did not know why that particular thing made something loosen in his chest, but it did. Drac came again the second evening and sat for another hour and said even less. Sierra passed the open door at some point during the second visit and paused in the hallway, looking in at the Varath trainer sitting in the too small chair next to the too large bed with the human cadet who had burns on both arms, and her face did something quiet and private that she did not share with anyone. The formal debrief was held the morning after Ryo was released. The main briefing room was large enough to hold all crew at full standing capacity, and it did every cadet, every officer, every rating on the Resolute, standing at attention in rows. Admiral Vane had crossed from the clarity of motion for the occasion, which was noted by everyone present without anyone saying so. The debrief ran through the incident in operational terms, timeline, decision points, outcome. When it reached the conduit run, the presenting officer read the entry flatly and without editorial comment. Then Admiral Vane spoke. Korathi commendation was not ceremony. It was not flowers and speeches and the swell of orchestral music. It was a single sentence, delivered in front of witnesses, which in Korathi law and culture carried the same formal weight as a signed document. The Admiral stood at the front of the room, looked directly at Ryo and said, "This one acted when action was needed. The Korathi fleet acknowledges it." Then he returned to his position and said nothing further. The room did not erupt. It was a military briefing. But the silence after those words had a different quality than the silence before them, and everyone in the room felt it, and Anu, standing in his row with his back straight and his hands at his sides, closed his eyes for exactly 1 second and then opened them again. After the debrief, the crew dispersed into their regular duties. Ryo was walking back toward the cadet quarters when footsteps behind him caught up to him, and Anu fell into step beside him without asking. They walked together for a moment without speaking. Then Anu said, quietly, not looking at him, "In Varath tradition there is a thing that happens when one warrior saves another's life without being ordered to, without expectation of reward, without even thinking about it first." He paused. "It creates a designation, a category, not of rank, of relationship." He said the Varath word. It was short, 2 syllables, and it sat in the air differently than the words around it, the way some words do when they are old enough that they carry the weight of everyone who has ever said them before. Anu did not translate it. He did not explain it further. He stopped walking, which meant Ryo stopped walking, and Anu looked at him directly for the first time in a way that was not assessment or dismissal or the careful nothing he had used before. Just looked at him. Then he turned and walked away. Ryo stood in the corridor for a moment. That evening he went back to the observation corridor on the lower level, the one with the long strip of windows and the amber floor light, and the stars outside that never moved. He had not been there since the night he and Drac had talked about Vethkai and Earth, and the old word for the planet that refused. He stood at the window and looked out, and after a while heard footsteps that he recognized by their weight and their pace. Drac stood beside him at the window. "You knew he would come find me," Ryo said. "I knew," Drac said. The stars outside were the same ones they had always been, which was the thing Ryo had come to find reliable about them. They held their positions. They did not shift based on what had happened below. Drac said the word. The same one Anu had said, but different, heavier, older, spoken with the full weight of someone who had been carrying it for weeks and was only now setting it down in the right place. The Varath word for the bond between warriors who have shared and been witnessed in it. Not a word given easily. Not a word the Varath gave to many. A word that in their oldest tradition was considered a permanent alteration of the relationship between two people. not something that could be unsaid or undone any more than you could unsay the shape of a scar. Ryo listened to it land. He did not know all the history in it. He did not know all the generations of Varath who had said it to each other in the aftermath of things that almost ended them. He would learn it slowly, over time. But he felt the shape of it now, the weight and the warmth of it, the way it closed something that had been open since the first day on this ship when he had fixed a pipe in the dark and no one had noticed. Someone had noticed. "Took you long enough," he said. Drax's face did not change. It almost never did. But his eyes shifted just slightly, just enough in the way that some things shift when they finally arrive somewhere they were always going. Outside the window, the stars kept their promise. The ship moved through them without asking permission. And in the amber-lit corridor on the lower deck of the GSV Resolute, two people stood at a window together, and the silence between them was the good kind. The kind that does not need to be filled because it is already full.